She stood at the altar in a dress that wasn't hers, holding flowers she hadn't chosen, about to marry a man she had never met. At least, that was what she believed. The chapel was small, suffocating, and wrong in every way a wedding could be wrong. The candles burned too low, casting the kind of shadows that swallow faces whole. The pews were empty except for 4 men in black suits stationed like sentinels, their expressions carved from stone, their hands never far from the weapons hidden beneath their jackets. There were no guests, no music, no mother crying in the front row, just cold marble floors, flickering orange light, and the weight of a life being handed over like a debt that needed to be settled. Because that was exactly what it was. Celeste Marino stood perfectly still, because still was the only option available to her. She had learned that 2 hours ago, when the black car had arrived at her apartment door and the man named Nikolai had knocked once, just once, and told her without a single trace of apology in his voice that she would be getting dressed. And coming with him, he had placed a garment bag on her bed. He had set a pair of white-heeled shoes on her floor, and then he had stood in a hallway with his arms folded while she stared at him in disbelief, waiting for the part where this turned out to be a terrible joke. It never did. Her father had done this. She knew it the moment Nikolai said the name. Voss. She didn't know the first name. She didn't know the face. But the Voss name was whispered like a warning in certain parts of the city, in back rooms and underground clubs. In the late-night conversations that men like her father were always having on the phone with the door closed. The Voss name meant power so absolute it didn't need to raise its voice. It meant wealth so deep it had no visible bottom. And it meant danger, the quiet, permanent kind that didn't announce itself before it arrived. Celeste had begged her father to fix his mistakes 1,000 times. She had paid his smallest debts with her librarian's salary. She had sold her grandmother's bracelet to cover 1 bad month. She had believed, again and again, in a man who gave her every reason to stop. And now here she was, standing in borrowed silk at an altar in a chapel she'd never seen, about to pay the ultimate price for a man who had gambled away his life and handed her over his change. She hated him. She hated herself for still loving him. And she hated, most of all, that she hadn't run faster. The door at the far end of the chapel opened, and the man who walked through it was not what she expected. She didn't know what she had expected exactly. Something monstrous, perhaps. Something visibly cruel, a face that wore its sins openly, the way she imagined all men like him must. But the man who walked toward her down the empty aisle was tall and controlled and devastatingly composed, dressed in a black suit so precisely fitted, it looked engineered rather than tailored. His dark hair was swept back from a face of sharp angles and quiet severity, and his eyes, even from this distance, even in this dim light, were a color that sat somewhere between gray and storm, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and felt too little, or so they wanted you to believe. He walked without hurry. He stopped beside her at the altar. He did not look at her. The old priest, Father Benedict, cleared his throat twice before beginning, the words spilling from him in a nervous rush, as though he had been instructed to complete the ceremony as quickly as God would allow. Celeste felt the room tilting slightly beneath her feet. She told herself it was the heels. She told herself a great many things in those minutes. And then the moment came. The vows. A simple, shattering question that Father Benedict directed at her, with something very close to sympathy in his aged eyes. Celeste opened her mouth to refuse. She had rehearsed this in the car. She would refuse. She would say no, loudly, clearly, without hesitation, because she had not come this far in her 26 years to be sold. She felt the shift in the air behind her before she heard the sound, the low, mechanical click of a safety being released. One of the men in the pews. She didn't need to turn around to understand. She looked at the priest. She looked at the man beside her for the first time, truly looked, turned and faced him fully and found him already watching her with those impossible gray eyes, and in them was something she did not expect to find. Not triumph, not cruelty, not even impatience. Something that looked, impossibly, like regret. "I do," Celeste said, and the words tasted like ashes in her mouth. Her name was Celeste Marino, and before all of this, she had lived a life so quiet it was almost invisible. She was 26 years old. She worked as a translator and part-time archivist at the Alderton City Library, a tall, sunlit building on the corner of Briar and 4th that smelled permanently of old paper and lavender wood polish. She spoke 4 languages fluently and 2 passably. She had a small apartment with too many books and not enough furniture. a best friend named Vivienne who brought her wine on Thursday evenings, and a father who called only when he needed something. Marco. Marino was not a bad man. That was the tragedy of him. He was a weak man, which, in the long run, caused more damage than outright cruelty ever could. He had been a middling businessman once, a man of modest but dignified means, the kind of father who remembered birthdays and told terrible jokes and genuinely tried. And then her mother died when Celeste was 17, and something in Marco had gone loose and never tightened again. The gambling had started slowly, the way all disasters do. A few card games, a few losses that balanced against occasional wins, and then the wins stopped coming and the losses grew larger and the men he owed money to grew less patient with each passing season. By the time Celeste understood the true depth of his situation, it was already structural, built into the walls of his life. Impossible to separate from the man himself. She had loved him through it. She had carried it with him. And when the black car arrived at her door that evening in early April, some part of her, the exhausted, bone-deep part that had been braced for catastrophe for years, felt not shocked, but the grim relief of finally arriving somewhere you always knew. You were headed. What she had not known, what no amount of bracing could have prepared her for, was the name of the man her father had sold her to, Luca Voss, head of the Voss Syndicate, son of the legendary Adric Voss, who had built an empire across 3 cities from nothing but ruthlessness and intelligence. The Voss family controlled shipping routes and private banking channels and a dozen legitimate-looking businesses that existed, entirely to launder money and move product across borders that didn't officially acknowledge them. Luca had inherited it all at 28 when his father was killed by a rival's bullet, and in the 6 years since, he had not only maintained the empire but expanded it in ways that made his father's legacy look modest. He was feared, he was untouchable, and now, because her father had borrowed $2 million from a Voss-affiliated lender and had absolutely no means or intention of repaying it, he was her husband. Celeste sat in the back of the black car that drove her from the chapel to the Voss estate and stared at the city through the tinted window and told herself she was not afraid. She repeated it like a prayer. She was not afraid. She would not break. She had survived her mother's death and her father's collapse and years of quiet loneliness, and she would survive this too. The estate appeared through the iron gates like something from a darker century. A sprawling stone mansion set back from the road behind walls lined with old oak trees that had grown so tall they blocked the stars. The windows were lit from within, warm amber against the night, but the warmth felt performative somehow, like a house wearing a costume of comfort. He didn't quite believe in. Nikolai opened the car door. Celeste stepped out onto the gravel drive, still in the silk dress, still carrying the flowers she had never once wanted, and looked up at the house that was now, in every legal sense, her home. She took a breath, and she walked inside. The first days were silence. Luca Voss was a man who occupied space the way thunderstorms did. You were always aware of him, always adjusting to his presence, even when he was in a different room. He moved through his own house with the precise economy of someone who had long ago decided that wasted motion was a form of weakness, and he spoke to Celeste in exactly the volume necessary and no more, directing staff to show her to her room, informing her of the household's schedule, establishing clear and immediate boundaries without ever raising his voice. They had separate rooms. He had arranged this before she arrived, as though he had known she would need it, or had needed it himself. Celeste spent her first night sitting on the edge of a bed larger than her entire bedroom at home, in a room that smelled of cedarwood and something faintly floral, and stared at the closed door between her quarters and his until the candle on the bedside table burned down to nothing. She should have hated everything about this place. And she did, logically. She categorized her hatred carefully, the way she catalogued books her father's betrayal filed first, then the injustice of her situation, then the cold architecture of the man who had engineered it. She had every reason to feel only contempt for this house and the man who owned it, but the truth, the inconvenient and complicated truth, was that the house was beautiful in the way that old, serious things are beautiful, not prettily or warmly, but with a depth that announced itself, slowly, and the man who owned it was not what she had expected, not the monster she had constructed in the car on the way over, and she hated that most of all. She met his sister on the third morning. Alara Voss was 24, 2 years younger than Celeste, with her brother's sharp bone structure softened into something more open and far more readable. She found Celeste in the garden, sitting on a stone bench with a book she wasn't reading, and sat down beside her without asking permission in a way that somehow didn't feel rude. "He's not good at this," Alara said, by way of introduction. Celeste looked at her sideways. "At what, people?" Alara tilted her head toward the house. "He never has been, but he's especially not good at this." A small pause. "I'm Alara, his sister, the one with a personality. Despite everything, despite the dress and the altar and the gun click and the $2 million of debt that had purchased her presence." Celeste laughed. It was a small, startled sound, the kind that escapes before you've decided to let it. It felt strange in her chest, like using a muscle she'd forgotten she had. Alara smiled, satisfied, as though she had accomplished something deliberate. Became, in those early weeks, something that cautiously resembled friendship. Alara showed her the estate's library, a room 2 floors high, lined entirely with shelves that made Celeste's heart physically hurt with longing, and told her she could use it whenever she wished. She introduced her to the household staff with warmth and normalcy that made everyone more comfortable. She gave Celeste, in the way that only genuinely kind people can, the sense that she was not entirely alone in a foreign country. And through Alara, slowly, Celeste began to understand pieces of Luca. Not the Luca who sat across from her at the long dining table 3 nights a week in formal, excruciating silence. Not the Luca who left before dawn and returned after dark, and moved through their shared spaces like a man who had agreed to a life but not committed to inhabiting it. But the Luca that existed in the small details of his house, in the worn spines of the books in the library that had clearly been read and reread, in the photographs on the study wall that included his mother's face with a softness the rest of the house didn't possess, in the way the staff spoke about him when he wasn't present, not with the terrified reverence of people who feared their employer, but with something that resembled, quietly, loyalty. The Luca that existed in those details was not a monster. That was the most disorienting thing of all. It happened on the 17th day Celeste was in the library, reshelving a book she'd borrowed from the upper level, balanced on a rolling ladder that was slightly less stable than it appeared. The book was a collection of Italian poetry, beautiful but heavy. One of those large art print editions that weighed significantly more than good sense suggested, and in the process of pushing it back into its place, it slipped from her hands and fell. It did not hit the floor. Luca caught it. He had come into the library without sound, the way he always moved, and he stood below the ladder with the book in his hands, looking up at her with those grey eyes, and for a moment neither of them moved. She was close enough now, above him, but close enough to see details that distance had blurred before. A small scar at the corner of his jaw, the way his brows drew slightly together when he focused, the precise shape of his mouth, which seemed permanently arranged in a stillness just shy of expressionless. She knew that stillness. She had been trying to place it for 17 days. That persistent, inexplicable sense of recognition she felt every time she studied him. She told herself it was the nature of forced proximity. When you lived with someone, you began to feel as though you'd known them longer than you had. But it wasn't that. She knew it wasn't that. It was something else. Something physical and precisely a melody you can't quite remember the name of but would know in an instant if someone played the first few notes. "Thank you," she said. The words came out smaller than intended. He looked at the book cover for a moment, the gold, embossed script of Giacomo Leopardi's collected works, and something moved through his expression. Too quickly for her to name it. "You read Italian poetry," he said. It was not quite a question. "I translate it," she said. "Oh, I did. Before." Another silence. He held the book up toward her on the ladder, and she took it, and their fingers did not touch, but came close enough that she was aware of the air between them as a separate, charged thing. He turned to leave. "Why did you marry me?" she asked. He stopped. He did not turn around immediately, and in the pause she could feel the weight of the question sitting between them like something dropped. "Your father owed a debt," he said. The answer was technically accurate and completely inadequate, and she suspected they both knew it. "That's why my father gave me away," she said. "That's not why you took me." A longer pause, and then Luca Voss, the most controlled man she had ever encountered, turned slightly and looked at her over his shoulder with those grey eyes, and said nothing at all, which, she was beginning to understand, was itself a kind of answer. The night of the dinner party changed everything. It was a mandatory social engagement, a gathering of a dozen carefully selected people in the formal dining room, the kind of evening that existed to maintain appearances and reinforce alliances. Celeste wore a dress Alara had chosen for her, deep, navy, silken structured, the kind of dress that made a statement simply by existing. She sat at the far end of the table and listened and observed and played the role of composed new wife. With a fluency that surprised her, there was a man at the table named Dominic Caruso. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired and wide-smiled. The kind of man who had learned very early that presenting as charming was a more effective weapon than presenting as threatening. He spoke as early about nothing, the way powerful men often do when they want to appear harmless. He had arrived with a gift, an expensive bottle of wine, meaninglessly lavish, and had kissed Celeste's hand when introduced, and had looked at her just a moment too long, with just a fraction too much interest that she had noticed, and she saw Luca had noticed too. For the rest of that evening, Luca Voss sat at the head of his table with the exact same face he always wore, controlled, unreadable, carved from some mineral that didn't register temperature, but he shifted the conversation whenever Dominic directed it toward Celeste. He intercepted questions. He kept his body angled subtly between them in the room. She watched him do it with the quiet precision of a man accustomed to managing threats he hadn't fully classified yet, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt watched over. After the guests left, she found him alone in the study, his jacket removed, a glass of something amber untouched on the desk in front of him. He was staring at the window at the dark garden beyond and didn't turn when she entered. "Dominic Caruso," she said. "Yes, he's danger a beat. Most men in this city are." He watched him the entire evening. "I watch everyone." She stood in the doorway and looked at his back, and felt the familiar frustration of trying to read a language she didn't have a key for. Is he the reason she started, and then stopped? Because she didn't know yet how to finish that sentence, and he didn't push her to. She went to bed that night with more questions than she'd started with, and lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around her, and found herself, for the first time, not just enduring her circumstances but actively trying to understand them. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks into her marriage, when the memory surfaced. She had been in the estate's east sitting room, sunlight falling across the Persian rug in long, afternoon bars, rereading a poem she'd been translating. The poem was about a masquerade, a Venetian carnival piece, full of masks and hidden faces and the particular cruelty of not knowing the person beneath the disguise. And something about the words, the rhythm of them, snagged on a corner of her memory like fabric on a rough edge. The Whitmore Gala 7 months ago. It had been a charity event at the Whitmore Hotel, the kind of evening Celeste attended occasionally, because Vivian's employer sponsored the ticket and Vivian refused to go alone to anything that required heels. It had been a masquerade theme, which Celeste had found precious and slightly ridiculous, and she had worn a simple silver mask over her eyes and spent the first hour standing near the AW's table, translating the speeches in her head into 3 languages, because her brain needed something to do, and then a man had asked her to dance. He had been wearing a black mask, full-faced, structured, the kind that concealed the upper half entirely but left the jaw and mouth visible. He had asked her without preface, simply extending a hand, and she had accepted without fully deciding to, because something about the gesture had been so precisely calibrated between confidence and courtesy that refusal hadn't occurred to her. They had danced for one song, and then another, and then they had ended up near the tall windows overlooking the city, and they had talked for what felt like an hour but was probably 3, and it was the most honestly she had spoken to anyone in years about her mother, about languages, about the particular loneliness of being fluent in things no one around you wanted to say. He had listened with a quality of attention that felt like a physical presence, like he was gathering every word. He had spoken sparingly, and everything he said was either unexpectedly perceptive or quietly, darkly funny, and she had found herself leaning closer without choosing to. She had never seen his full face. The mask, he had not removed it. Near the end of the evening, she had asked him who he was, and he had said only, "Someone who will remember this," which was the kind of answer that should have felt theatrical and cheap and instead landed in her chest like something real. She had almost asked him to stay. She had almost asked for his number. She had done neither, because she was cautious in the way that only people who have been disappointed repeatedly learn to be cautious. And when she turned back from the window for just a moment, he was gone. She had thought about him for weeks afterward. She had told Viviane about him over wine, described him in the particular careful way of someone who doesn't want to sound hopeful but is. She had gone back to the hotel gala the following year on the slim, barely acknowledged chance that he might appear again. He hadn't, And then life had happened, as it always does, and the man in the black mask had receded into the soft background of things that almost were. Celeste sat in the east sitting room with the poem in her lap and felt the memory hit her like cold water. The jawline, the stillness, the quality of attention that lived in the eyes, even when the rest of the face revealed nothing. The way he had caught the poetry book and looked at the cover with that flash of something she couldn't name. Someone who will remember. This. She stood up so quickly, the poem fell to the floor. She found him in the study that evening. She didn't knock. Luca looked up from the papers on his desk with that controlled patience that was beginning to feel less like coldness and more like discipline, like a man holding something in place very deliberately. Nikolai was standing near the window and straightened when she entered, but she didn't look at him. She was looking at Luca. "Tell me about the Whitmore Gala," she said. A silence so thin it was almost translucent settled over the room. Nikolai found somewhere else to be. Luca set down his pen with the deliberate care of a man who needed a half-second to decide something. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at her with those grey eyes, and this time she was looking for it. The thing she hadn't known to look for before, and she found it. The recognition that had always been there. The recognition she had mistaken for impassivity. "Celeste, it was you." Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was, given that her hands were shaking. The masquerade, 7 months ago. The man in the black mask. She crossed the room until she was standing at the edge of his desk. "That was you." He didn't deny it. He let out a breath that was slow and controlled and fractionally imperfect. And for the first time in all these weeks she saw a crack in the composure, not a collapse. Nothing so dramatic, but it seemed a line where the mineral surface hadn't quite sealed. "Yes," he said. The word was so simple. So quiet. So entirely insufficient for what it contained. "You knew who I was," she said. "At the gala. You knew my name." "No," he said. And then, slower, "Not that night. That night I only knew you were the woman by the window who was translating the speeches to herself and thought no one could see." A pause. "I didn't know your name until 3 months later. Asterisk, when my father came to you. When your father came. To my people, yes." She stared at him. She felt the room rearranging itself around her. The way perspectives shift when you discover a hidden third dimension in something you thought was flat. "And when you found out who I was, when my father's debt became connected to my name, you already knew what I looked like. You already knew." She stopped. "Did you arrange this? Did you choose me? Your father chose to borrow money. He couldn't repay," Luca said. His voice was careful. "I was presented with collateral. That's not what I asked." Another silence, longer this time. "When Nikolai brought me your father's file," he said, "and your photograph was in it," he paused. Something moved behind his eyes. "I could have passed the debt to someone else. There are people in my organization who handle these arrangements. I could have redirected it." The air left the room. "But you didn't," she said. Double quotes. "No." She didn't know what to do with that. She stood at the edge of his desk and felt the understanding rearranging everything. The altar, the gun click, the separate rooms, the library. The way he had intercepted Dominic's attention all evening, and she felt something shifting in her chest that she was not ready to name and was certainly not going to name in this room. In this conversation, under these circumstances, that evening, she said, and her voice was quieter now, at the Whitmore. "What was a man like you doing at a charity gala wearing a mask?" Something close to a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. Just barely. Like a language she was only beginning to learn how to read. "There are certain environments in which it's useful not to be recognizable," he said. "And yet you talked to me for 3 hours." "Yes." The almost smile deepened by a fraction. "That was not part of any plan." She held his gaze for a long moment. He held hers. And in the silence between them was everything that had been accumulating for weeks. The dinners, the library, the study doorway, the book, all of it rearranged now in this new light. This context, this inconvenient and overwhelming truth. Walked out of the study without another word. Because she needed air. She needed distance. She needed to put walls between herself and the feeling that was rising in her chest like floodwater, and she needed to think. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark of her enormous room and turned it over and over, the story from every angle, examining it for the comfort of finding it manipulative, finding calculation in it, finding something she could point to and say, "There, that's the thing that makes him exactly what I expected." She looked for it carefully. She was thorough. She spoke 4 languages and understood nuance better than most people. And she examined the facts of the situation with everything she had, and she kept arriving at the same place. He had not manufactured their first meeting. He had not known who she was. A man like Luca Voss, if he had been engineering a situation, would have introduced himself, would have pursued her through channels that people like him had easy access to, would not have danced and talked and then disappeared without leaving a name or a number, and would certainly not have arranged a forced marriage as a means of courtship. Because a man of his power had infinitely cleaner ways of acquiring what he wanted. What had happened was simpler and far more complicated than manipulation. He had met her and remembered her, and when fate, or rather, her father's catastrophic incompetence had brought her name across his desk, he had not redirected it, he had claimed it, had brought her into his house and given her a library and separate rooms and space and the particular protection of a man who was dangerous in all the ways that counted, and had not once made her feel unsafe. She thought about this until the room began to gray with early light, and then she got up and went to find him. He was already awake. She found him in the garden, which surprised her. She had imagined him always at his desk, always surrounded by the machinery of his world, but he was standing near the old stone wall at the far end, his jacket off, a coffee in his hand, watching the first light come over the trees with an expression she had never seen on him, unguarded, quiet in a way that was different from his usual silence, softer, private. He heard her footsteps on the gravel and turned, and when he saw her in her coat over her pajamas, her hair loose, coming toward him in the pale morning, something moved in his face that he didn't manage to conceal. In time she stopped a few feet from him. That night she said, without preamble, "You said you would remember." "I did," he said. "Did you mean it, or was it just something you said?" He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was doing something complicated to his face, making the hard lines of it softer, making the gray of his eyes lighter, and she was standing close enough to see the way he breathed, the slight movement of his chest. "I thought about you for months," he said. It was the most unpracticed thing she had ever heard him say, the most honest. After that evening, it wasn't something I was accustomed to. Thinking about someone, being unable to stop. The silence that followed was the loudest she had ever stood inside. She looked at him, this man who had frightened her and infuriated her and confused her and protected her, and caught her poetry book and watched over her across a dinner table, and talked to her for 3 hours in a mask at a charity gala because something had made him cross the room. And she felt the last of her constructed distance crumbling like something wet. "You could have told me," she said. "When I arrived, you could have said what would you have believed," he said, not defensively, just honestly, that the man who'd had you escorted to a chapel at Gunpoint was also the man from your favorite evening in years. You would have thought I was lying. You would have thought it was manipulation. She was quiet. "I know how this looks," he said. "I know what I am, Celeste, and I know what I built, and what I've done, and what this house represents. I didn't tell you because I wanted. You too have the chance to see it for yourself, without the story coloring it." "Without the story," she repeated, and her voice was very soft. "That's a very careful way to manage an impossible situation. I manage what I can." She stepped closer to him, close enough that the morning air between them felt thin, and looked up at his face and let herself see it truly. Finally, without the defenses she'd built and the categories she'd filed him in, and it was the same face, the same jaw, the same eyes above a different mask, or rather no mask at all. And she understood at last why she'd felt that pull toward him in the library. At dinner, across every polished surface they'd shared in this house, she had already, 7 months ago in a room full of strangers, decided that she could love a man like him, if he was real, but the world inside Luca Voss's life, did not have the patience for personal revelations. 2 days after the garden conversation, Nikolai appeared at the library door with a face that carried news Celeste had already learned to read, not the careful blankness of routine days, but the particular tight-jawed stillness that meant the world outside. The walls had sent something their way. She put down her book. "What happened?" she said. Nikolai looked at her in a way that acknowledged, for the first time, that she had a right to the information. "There's been an incident at one of the docks," he said. "Mr. Voss has asked that you remain inside the estate. Today, she remained inside, but she listened. The pieces came together over the following 48 hours in fragments through Ilara, who was a reluctant but honest source when pressed, through conversations she wasn't supposed to overhear, through the particular frequency of tension that ran through the household. When something serious was in motion, Dominic Caruso, it was always going to be Dominic Caruso. Elara sat with her in the library on the second evening and finally told her the shape of it, because Elara had decided somewhere along the way that Celeste was not an outsider to be protected from information, but a person who deserved to understand the ground she was standing on. Dominic Caruso was not simply a social rival. He was a man who had been systematically dismantling Voss operations for 2 years, not with open warfare, which would have required courage and clarity, but with the far more corrosive strategy of quiet infiltration. He had placed people inside Voss-connected businesses. He had been cultivating relationships with Luca's outer circle, looking for purchase, for weakness, for a seam he could work open. He had 18 months ago been responsible for the death of Luca's chief financial officer, an event disguised as a mugging that had fooled no one who mattered. And Dominic wanted more than territory. He wanted everything. The kind of man who believes that if he cannot have what someone else has built, the only satisfying resolution is destruction. What does this have to do with me? Celeste asked. Elara was quiet for a moment. Dominic has been acquiring leverage, she said carefully, against Luca, against our family, against our alliances. She looked at her hands. When your father's debt came across Luca's desk, when your name came with it, Nikolai flagged something we hadn't noticed before. Your father's lender wasn't independent, but debt had been purchased by a Caruso-fronted account 8 months ago. Celeste went very still. He bought my father's debt. He was planning to use it, Elara said. To use you. We don't know exactly what the plan was, perhaps as a hostage. Perhaps as a pressure point against people your father still had connections to. But Dominic acquiring your father's debt was not accidental. She met Celeste's eyes. Luca found out 2 weeks before your father's deadline. He moved faster than Dominic expected. Asterisk, the silence in the library was enormous. He married me, Celeste said slowly, so that Dominic couldn't get to me. He married you so that you would be untouchable, Elara said. Under Voss protection. Under Voss' name. So that whatever Dominic was planning, it would already be obsolete. A pause. That was the beginning of the reason. The beginning. Celeste sat with that word and everything it implied and felt the full architecture of the past weeks reorganize itself into something she could almost see clearly from where she was standing. The forced marriage. The gunpoint altar. The cold, careful distance. The library and the separate rooms and the study conversations and the garden in the morning. He had not wanted to tell her, because how do you tell someone, I claimed you before, a dangerous man could use you as a weapon? And somewhere in the process I discovered I couldn't let you go, and I don't entirely know which reason is which anymore. She was still sitting with all of this, turning it in her hands like a complicated thing she didn't want to drop, when Elara's phone rang. And the sound of Elara's voice as she answered it, the specific drop in pitch, the sudden brightness leaving it told Celeste, before a single word was spoken, that something had gone wrong. Elara was gone. It happened while Celeste had been in the library and Luca had been at the docks. Elara had gone to meet a friend, a normal, civilian afternoon. The kind Elara took occasionally because she refused to allow her brother's world to consume every hour of her life. She had been gone for hours before the message arrived. Dominic Caruso had heard odd. Luca received the message in the car. Celeste learned this from Nikolai's face when he came to her room, and from the sound of Luca's voice in the hall, the only time she had ever heard it raised, the only time it had shed every layer of control, a single sharp command that cut through the house like something physical. She came out of her room before Nikolai could ask her to stay in it. Luca was standing in the foyer in his full coat, already surrounded by men. Nikolai at his right shoulder, his face reconfigured into something she hadn't seen before. Not cold, not controlled, stripped, raw, in the particular way that only the threat of lust can strip a person down to. When he saw her, he crossed the foyer, in 5 steps. Stay here, he said. His voice was low. Stay inside the estate. Do not open the gate for anyone. Nikolai's man Theo is stationed at the door. Do you understand me? Luca, do you understand me? Celeste. She looked at him at the fear underneath all the authority, the way it lived in his jaw, in the set of his eyes, and she took his face in both her hands, which seemed to shock him profoundly, and she said, bring her home, something in. Him fractured, just for a second, just a flash, gone, as quickly as lightning, but she saw it. His hands came up and covered hers against his jaw, briefly. pressing hard, a gesture so uncharacteristic of him and so nakedly human that it cracked something open in her chest. "I will," he said. He let go. He turned. He walked out of the door. And Celeste, who had always been the kind of woman who stayed where she was told, stood in the foyer for exactly 3 minutes before she went to find her phone and called Vivian. Not because Vivian could help, but because Celeste needed to speak to someone who knew who she had been before all of this. While she tried to figure out who she was becoming, she found out later, in pieces, what had happened at the warehouse near the southern waterfront. Dominic had not expected Luca to move so fast. That was the first miscalculation of a man who had been underestimating Luca Voss for 2 years. And it proved to be the definitive one. Luca arrived 40 minutes after the message, with 6 men and a level of controlled rage that, according to Nikolai, who recounted it later in a tone of someone who had witnessed something he would be thinking about for a long time, was more effective than any weapon in the room. Dominic had brought 12 men. He had brought Elara as collateral. He had brought, presumably, a great deal of confidence in his own leverage. What he hadn't brought was any real understanding of what Luca Voss became when someone touched his family. The confrontation was brief. It was also thorough. Dominic had laid out his terms, his demands, his conditions. The transaction he believed himself to be conducting in the tone of a man who thought he held all the power. Luca had listened to every word with his hands still and his face composed and his grey eyes the temperature of a February morning. And then he had dismantled it. Not with violence, first with information. With the evidence his people had spent 2 years compiling while Dominic had been busy believing himself invisible. The fake mugging, the planted assets, the purchased debt, the trail of it, neat and documented. That led back to Dominic in a way that would be very interesting to the people above both of them in the city's hierarchy. The kind of people who required that certain rules be maintained, and who did not take kindly to those who conducted private wars in the communal space. Dominic's confidence had not survived contact with evidence. He had tried to pivot, he had tried to threaten. And that was when the carefully maintained control in Luca Voss's eyes had finished performing its function. And Dominic Caruso had discovered, at last, why no one who truly understood this city's landscape had tested the Voss family in 6 years. Elara came home at midnight. She was shaken and white-faced, but unharmed. And she walked through the estate door and into Celeste's arms, because Celeste was the one standing in the foyer. Because Celeste had refused to go to bed and held on for a long, wordless minute. Luke walked in behind her, and across the foyer he met Celeste's eyes above his sister's shoulder, and what passed between them in that look was too large for any room to contain. It was the quiet after everything that was the hardest. The estate settled into an unusual stillness in the days following the particular stillness of a world. After a storm, where the air is cleaner than it has any right to be and everything feels both fragile and intensely real, the thread of Dominic was not over entirely. These things never were, but its teeth had been pulled, its architecture exposed. And the city's senior powers had made their displeasure known in ways that would keep Dominic very busy and very careful for a long time. Celeste woke on the 4th morning after and lay in the brightening room and felt the sum total of everything, the weeks, the discovery, the fear, the garden and the morning. The way his hands had pressed hers against his jaw and knew she was in love with her husband. It was not the simple, clean love of uncomplicated things. It was the kind that arrives through difficulty, that builds itself from conflict and proximity and slowly accumulated truth. That looks nothing like the love you imagined when you were young and still believed it would be easy. It was the kind that cost something. And Celeste Morano, who had spent years translating other people's most beautiful words into languages that could carry them further, was now sitting with a feeling she had no language ready for. She went to find him. Again, as apparently was now her habit, he was in the study, not at his desk this time, but standing at the window, the same window she had seen him at on a dozen occasions. Looking out of the garden with that expression of his that she had only recently learned to read. He turned when she entered, and she saw, with a clarity she could not have accessed a month ago, that he was braced for her, that he had been braced for her, that this man who feared nothing in any external sense of the word was afraid of whatever she was going to say to him. "I've been thinking," she said, "about all the ways this could have gone differently." He waited. "My father could have borrowed from someone else. You could have redirected the debt. Dominic could have moved on me before you got there. I could have refused at the altar, genuinely refused, loudly, regardless of the consequences. And she paused. None of those things happened, and I keep arriving at the same question, which is, she walked toward him slowly, the way you approach, something fragile that you want very much not to break. At the Whitmore, you said you would remember that evening. Asterisk.
Yes.
You remembered it for 7 months, and then my name ended up in a file on your desk, and you didn't redirect it. She stopped in front of him. Tell me the whole truth. Not the strategic version, not the reasonable version. The whole truth. The study was very quiet. Outside, the garden was green and gold in the afternoon light, the old oaks moving slowly in a wind that didn't quite reach the windows. Luca Voss stood in front of her and let down every last wall he had spent decades carefully constructing. And when he spoke, his voice was the most unguarded she had ever heard it. I made a decision when I was very young, he said, that the kind of life I was going to live didn't have room in it for attachment. That the safest thing for me and for anyone near me was to remain the kind of man that no one could reach through. He paused. I was good at it for a long time. She didn't speak. And then a woman stood at a ballroom window, translating speeches to herself. And something happened that I had no framework for and no intention of pursuing. And I walked away because that was what I did. He looked at her, and I thought about her for 7 months, which was not something I had a framework for either. And then she appeared in a file. And then you appeared in a file. His jaw was tight. And I made a choice that I could tell myself was strategic. I could tell myself I was protecting you from Dominic, keeping you out of his hands. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. What was the rest of it? The rest of it, he said quietly, was that I was not willing to let the only person who had made me feel like I could be something other than what I am disappear into someone else's situation. The afternoon light moved across the study floor like something slow and deliberate. Celeste looked at him for a long moment, at this man who was feared by an entire city and undone by a woman at a window, and she felt the whole impossible story of the past weeks arrange itself into something that, from this angle, from this close, looked very much like Grace. You could have told me, she said, for the second time, eventually. I know. There was something in his eyes that she understood. Now was the closest he could come to vulnerability. I was afraid that if I said it out loud before you'd had the chance to see it for yourself, you would only ever see the way it started. The chapel, the gun, the debt. He paused. I wanted you to have more than that story. I do, she said. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at it, at her fingers laced through his, with an expression that belonged to a completely different man than the one who had walked down an empty aisle in a dark chapel and stood beside a woman he had already decided not to let go. Then he raised his other hand and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. And it was a gesture so simple and so tender that she felt it in every part of herself. This is not going to be easy, he said. It wasn't a warning so much as an acknowledgement, the honest inventory of a man who respected her enough not to promise what he couldn't guarantee. This life, what I carry, what this world requires, it isn't going to be. I know what I'm saying yes to, she said. He looked at her. I'm a translator, she said. And her voice was steady even though her heart was doing something entirely unstable inside her chest. I've spent my whole life learning what people mean when they say difficult things imperfectly. I know what you're telling me. She stepped closer. And I know what you're not saying. And I'm saying yes to both. The last light of the afternoon came through the window and fell across them both, and Luca Voss, feared head of the Voss Syndicate, the most controlled man in a city full of powerful men, brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, and kept his eyes on hers as he did it, and she felt it rearrange something inside her that she suspected was never going back to its original position. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning that smelled of coffee and fresh rain, Celeste sat in the estate's east bathroom with a small plastic test in her hand, and felt the world tilt on its axis in an entirely new direction. The 2 lines were unambiguous. She sat with them for a long time, the window above the sink fogged with the morning's warmth, the house quiet around her. She felt the enormity of it expand outward in slow rings, like a stone dropped in still water, the fear, the wonder, the sheer audacity of new life, choosing to begin here, in this house, in this particular season. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach. She thought about her mother, who had loved fiercely and left too early. She thought about what it would mean to build a life inside a world like this, the walls she would need to help a child navigate, the values she would insist on, the specific courage required to raise something soft and tender in proximity. to something hard. And then she thought about Luca reading to a child in the library. She thought about Alara, who would be the kind of aunt who showed up with completely inappropriate gifts and excellent advice. She thought about the garden in the morning, and the oaks that had grown so tall they blocked the stars, and the way that house was beginning to feel less like a cage and more like a country. She was slowly learning the language of she carried. But as to the study, it was at his desk where I was working on something that was immediately set aside when she appeared in the doorway, because he had developed a very accurate read on her expressions in 3 months, and this one was clearly not a casual visit. He stood. She held up the test, without preface. The way she had always preferred to say true things directly, without decoration, because some things deserve to arrive unencumbered. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He took the test from her hand. He looked at it for a long, very still moment, and she watched his face with the fluency she had spent weeks acquiring. And what she saw there, beneath the careful control, beneath the surface that the rest of the world never got to look past, was not alarm, was not calculation, was not the complicated renegotiation of a man confronted with a problem. It was wonder. It was the soft fractured look of a man who had built walls so high that life had had to marry him at gunpoint to get inside them, and who was only now standing in a study in the morning light with a plastic test in his hands, understanding that the life it had brought in with it was not ending anything, it was beginning something. A child, he said, and his voice had the quality of a man handling something he had never expected to hold. Celeste said. He raised his eyes to hers, and she saw in them the full gravity of it, all the ways it would complicate things, all the ways it would terrify him, all the ways it would require him to become something different and perhaps more than what he had built himself to be. She saw all of that, and she saw it land in him and settle. And she saw the moment he decided. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. Not with the careful restraint of a man who managed his proximity to people, but fully, immediately, with both hands, and held her in the kind of grip that says, I am not letting go of this. She pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart beating against her cheek and listened to it. And it was not the heart of a man who was afraid. It was steady. It was sure. It was the heart of a man who had spent too long alone and had run out of arguments against his own happiness. 6 months after that, on a warm September evening, Celeste sat in the library she had claimed as her own and read aloud in Italian to the room. The poetry bounced off the tall shelves and the worn spines and the amber lamplight, and outside the tall windows the oaks were turning gold. Lucas sat in the chair across from her, which was not something he had done in the early months, sitting in her space, in her radius, as though something magnetic had finally been acknowledged. He was supposed to be reading documents. He was not reading documents. He was watching her with a particular quietness that she had learned, by now, was not blankness but its exact opposite. You're not working, she said, without looking up from the poetry. No, he agreed. You're staring. Yes. She looked up. He met her eyes across the warm space between them. And something passed between them that was no longer a question or an arrangement or a story told from only one angle. It was the particular, daily intimacy of 2 people who had arrived at each other through the most improbable route available, debt and obligation and gunpoint and masquerade. Masks and 7 months of not knowing and 3 months of slowly knowing, and now this, a child growing quietly between them, a house that had stopped being a cage, a love built from the strangest materials and somehow stronger for it. I finished translating the poem, she said. Which one? The masquerade piece. The one about not knowing the person beneath the mask. She paused. I changed the ending. He raised an eyebrow. In the original, they never take the masks off, she said. The whole point is the nonning, the beautiful tragedy of it. She set the book aside and looked at him across the lamplight and felt the whole story of them alive in her chest, the chapel and the altar and the grey eyes. She had recognized before she knew why, and the garden in the morning, and all the terrible and necessary and ultimately right steps that had brought her here. I changed it so that they do. And what happens when they do? He asked. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that lives. Very close to tears, the kind that means you are full of something larger than your body knows how to contain. They recognize each other, she said. Lukovos looked at his wife across the library that smelled of old paper and evening air. And the thing that lived in his eyes, the thing the rest of the world never got to see, was entirely unguarded, entirely present. The expression of a man who had spent years believing that what he was would always be too much, and had been wrong. Yes, he said softly. Outside, The September wind moved through the old oaks, and the house held them both, and the story that had begun at an altar with a gun and a borrowed dress and a woman, who said the only words available to her, arrived, finally and completely, at the place where all great stories eventually arrive, if they are brave enough to keep going past the ending that seemed inevitable. Not a question, not a cage, not a debt, a beginning, and somewhere in the city, in a ballroom that would host another masquerade the following spring. A small silver mask sat in a display case, the kind they sold as souvenirs near the entrance. The kind that nobody ever bought. Celeste would see it. Months later, on an evening she and Luco attended together, publicly, officially, in the way that the Voss family now attended things. She would stop in front of it, and he would stop beside her, and they would look at it in the way that people look at the precise location where something important began, not with nostalgia, but with a kind of astonished gratitude that the path had led from there to here. She would take his hand, he would hold it in both of his, and they would walk into the ballroom together, unmasked, known, and it would feel like the truest thing in the world.